All right, we're live. Ashlee Vance, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It is my pleasure.
So, we're here to talk about your book, When the Heavens Went on Sale, which is a great title, by the way.
Thank you.
Really looking forward to talking about this with you. You previously wrote a biography about Elon Musk, which came out in 2015. Great book, and it was a bestseller. What prompted you to write a book about the space industry next?
Well, I tried not to. I'm not like a space junkie by nature at all. I was interested in it, but not like a lot of the people I report on, who dream about this stuff since they're kids. But when I did the Elon book, the SpaceX reporting was kind of my favorite part, learning about the early days of SpaceX. I got into the stars and exploring and all that, and just the mechanics of making rockets and the engineering that goes into it. And it was just kind of like a funny thing, right as I was finishing the book, SpaceX had been around long enough and had proven enough out that all of a sudden commercial space, which people had tried and failed at for years, was really taking off. And so really the initial bug of this was I did not think it would be a book. I just saw these young rocket companies and I was like, oh, I could kind of, I'd missed the very earliest days of SpaceX. And this was like an excuse to kind of get to see what a young baby rocket company's like. And then I just got the bug. All the characters were so fascinating. And there was this big global race taking place across the world. And it felt like a giant shift was happening. And so I got sucked in.
The book goes into detail on four space companies that you spent time with: Planet Labs, Rocket Lab, Astra, and Firefly. Before we get to them, let's set the stage here with NASA. One of the key characters in the book is a guy named Pete Worden.
Yeah.
Who is Pete Worden, and what did he believe about space innovation that sort of set him apart from some of his colleagues?
Yeah, Pete's one of my favorite characters in the book and one of my favorite characters in life. He's basically an astrophysicist by training. He's got a PhD in astrophysics. He was studying the nature of stars and things like that and got sucked into the Air Force. Pete's a bit older. He must be, I don't want to offend him. I would guess, in his late 70s these days or somewhere thereabouts, or his 70s. And so he'd gotten pulled into the Air Force coming out of college and ended up being on a whole bunch of weird programs. He used to run the technology part of the Star Wars Missile Defense Shield, the Strategic Defense Initiative during the Reagan years. He did a bunch of Black Ops stuff, and he ended up being in charge of this NASA center, NASA Ames, which is the Silicon Valley NASA outpost. And I always think of Pete as this man way ahead of his time. He takes over NASA Ames around 2005, and SpaceX was kind of in its earliest days, and people were talking about this new way to do rockets and things like that. But Pete Worden had been talking about this for literally decades. He'd been saying, we should do space cheaper. We need to make smaller rockets that can launch more easily. We need to make cheaper satellites, smaller satellites. And so he'd always been pushing the government to try some of these things. When he gets a hold of this NASA center, he finally has a chance to put all his theories into action by bringing in a lot of kind of 20 somethings that he just thought were smart and energetic and would chase after these weird ideas that he had. And so I tend to think of him, Elon's definitely I think gets the most credit for pushing us towards this new era of space. But I always think of Pete as kind of the second most influential.
How does Planet Labs emerge from the vision and the thesis about space that Pete Worden has?
Yeah, I mean, Pete was putting this foundation of Pete's basic theory is he calls NASA a self-licking ice cream cone. This organization that's just there to like preserve itself, and you never want the budget to go down because you got to keep the money that you got. You got to keep things expensive, and so one of Pete's big things was, look, come to me with ideas about how you can change the status quo. And so there was another Pete Klupar, who was Pete Worden's right-hand man at Ames. The iPhone had just come out, and then Google had come out with, what was it, the Nexus, I think, Android smartphone. And Pete Klupar had been listening to Pete Worden give these talks, and he said, look, these smartphones are pretty amazing. They've got all these sensors. They can do photographs, they can do video, they can have a lot of computing. They really have a lot of the parts of a satellite in this tiny package. Somebody should kind of like make use of this, and we could lower the cost of satellites. Like consumer electronics have gotten really, really good. And so this group of kids were listening to these discussions and they're like, all right, we'll try. Let's see if we can make a satellite out of a phone. So it starts as this project called this Phone Sat project, where they really just wanted to see, I guess it was two things, right? It was, can you send consumer electronics into space and have them survive the rocket launch, the harsh conditions of space, and still operate? And then if they're in orbit, can you actually like take a photo of the Earth just from a smartphone and see what happens? And so that's what they did. They went off to try to see if you could do this. Most people listening to this probably don't know, but since the history of the space program, most of the things that get sent to space are very expensive. It's like if it's a radio, it has to be a space grade radio that costs $200,000, and all these companies have certified, and NASA can trust it. So this idea of sending consumer electronics into space was really revolutionary, and nobody really knew if they would work. And it turned out they did.
Yeah, totally. I think of Planet Labs as the most sort of prototypical Silicon Valley company of the four covered in this book, partly because they're young kids living in basically like a hacker house together when they start the company. They're also pretty idealistic. They want to use this technology for the better. Can you talk a little bit about some of their kind of idealism and what they wanted to do with this technology?
Yeah, yeah, he shortchanged like some of the founding story. I mean, that was kind of like how it began at NASA Ames. And once they sent those phones off to space, they're like, oh, that's interesting. A phone costs almost nothing. Most of these satellites cost $1 billion. And then the founders, like you said, Will Marshall, Robbie Schingler, Chris Boschhausen, they were these young college kids. They'd known each other forever. They'd been sort of pushing to remove weapons from space. And they basically just sat down and were like, okay, if you could make a really cheap satellite, what would you do with it? And the best plan they come up with is, okay, usually imaging satellites are enormous. They cost a ton of money. What if we piggyback off this phone camera and just make tons of really cheap imaging satellites? And then they really didn't, I don't believe, fully wanted to start a company. I think they wanted to start something more like a nonprofit. And the idea was to take photos of every spot on Earth and watch things like deforestation, check on refugees, see what's happening with bodies of water, the health of crops, like just to monitor the Earth's health and have this like real-time accounting system of what was going on. And so that was like the original mission. They call their satellites doves. It's all meant to be very peace-loving and to kind of take care of the planet.
Let's talk about Rocket Lab. So to some degree, Rocket Lab it's literally like the little engine that could.
Yeah.
Can you give just a brief overview of it and why the company could be viewed as a sort of underdog success story?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's always been this desire, well, always is a stretch. For decades, people have been hoping for a small rocket that was relatively cheap. Most of the rockets that governments fly, even SpaceX's workhorse, the Falcon 9, is a pretty big rocket. SpaceX charges about 60 million. Everybody else charges around like 200, 300 million to get to space. So that makes it tough if you want to try out new ideas, just sort of dabble to get things off the ground. Your starting cost is really high. So people have been hoping for a smaller rocket that just cost a few million. And that's what Rocket Lab set out to build. They're extraordinary because the company was started in New Zealand, which has no aerospace history of doing anything. And it was started by this guy, Peter Beck, who didn't go to college, had no any sort of formal aerospace training, had never worked at an aerospace company. He worked at a dishwasher appliance maker, and he just self-taught him. He was self-taught everything from propellants, making those in his shed, to engines. He made like a bike with a rocket engine on it. He made rocket powered roller skates, jet packs, all these things. And so he starts this company around 2008, and they've turned into this very surprising success. So there's SpaceX has launched hundreds of times, and is dominant, and then really there's nobody else that's launched more than once or twice except for Rocket Lab, which has now launched more than 50 rockets, and its rocket costs about $9 million, and it's just in this small rocket category is just completely dominant and is the only, in my mind, I mean there's more coming, but is the only like real other commercial rocket company.
There's a view of startup building that at the end of the day, the outcome really just depends on the founding team. And sometimes I think, at least with specific examples of successful companies, that view could be debated where you might point to other sort of market and timing dynamics. In this case, though, I struggle to see any other meaningful reason for success other than Peter Beck. What is it about him that maybe other founders should try to emulate, or potentially some investors should look for?
Yes, you're totally spot on. Sometimes there's a million factors that go into these companies, and it's hard to figure out exactly what the right recipe is. Peter, yeah, I do this for a living. I'm a reporter. I've met, I don't know, Lord knows how many startups, thousands. And every now and then you just meet someone who's just clearly in a different class and you just know they're going to succeed. And that I met Peter for the first time in 2015. The company was tiny back then. I could just tell this guy knew what he was doing, and he was, I think it's that quality of being, it's twofold. I think he was possessed by the mission and what he wanted to do, and you could tell that this was not an option. This was not something he was doing to make money. Making money would be nice, but it was like this guy had to build this rocket, and then he's uniquely actually capable at doing that. He's a one in a billion engineer. Obviously, it takes a team of people to make a rocket. I think it's, without creating some myth about Peter, it's a fact that the company's had quite a few moments where it looked like some impossible engineering challenge was ahead of it or was going to undermine everything they were doing, and Peter would figure out how to get around it. So, it is that combination. And then I would say his methodology, his sort of ethos permeates through the company. When you go to their factory in New Zealand, you could eat off the floor. When you go to the tool storage sections, everything's perfectly lined up. And it's not like Peter's going around every night rearranging stuff. This is people who are doing it the way he would want it to be done.
I saw recently there's a video of him on YouTube. I think it's from 2008, and he's pitching maybe some sort of angel investing group or something like that in New Zealand. And it's just crazy because now you can see him on CNBC talking about what they're going to do next. And it's really just an incredible journey. I totally agree. I think he's the clear leader of the company. And at least in the early days, it seemed like he was the most talented engineer. To have that combination is rare.
Their very first rocket, which was a very, very modest rocket, there were 3 people who built that, and Peter did most of the work and had been working on it for a long time. So yes, he was almost kind of like the sole engineer. But yeah, he knows everything about these rockets, and people should understand. I mean, this is the most unlikely story. Even in commercial space, you've got people of all different stripes working on the rocket, but the ones who are the CTOs, the CEOs, the top execs, they're all PhDs from MIT still. They all worked at SpaceX or at least Boeing or Lockheed. I mean, this dude, was literally, his job before he did this was designing parts of a dishwasher. He really is, after Elon Musk, it's like it's Peter Beck for sure. So it's a crazy story.
It is. Switching to a different leadership dynamic, I guess. Let's talk about Astra. One of the things I love about this book is that it showcases there are a lot of different ways that commercial space companies sort of come about, and it doesn't seem like there's really a consistent playbook for that across the board. So can you briefly explain just the origin of Astra and how it ultimately became to be a large venture backed company?
Yeah, I mean, you had this moment in time, like I was talking about, where around 2015 there was suddenly this boom of commercial rocket companies, and everybody had a slightly different thesis. You were either going to make a small rocket, or you were going to try to make a rocket faster than somebody else, or you had to have like a little bit of a difference. But there were all these companies trying, and what appealed to me about Astra was how extreme its thesis was, which they wanted to really be the first company to make a rocket like we would make a Cessna or we would make a Ford car, which is to say, like a proper factory, mass producing rockets, try to change the economics of the field by making a rocket every day, launching a rocket every day. And obviously, in this case, you're talking about a super cheap rocket, even cheaper than Rocket Lab. And so, really trying to change this business that, like SpaceX, is only now, they've kind of figured it out on some level where they're launching every couple days and making these sophisticated rockets. But in 2016, when Astra started, all these things are like handcrafted, they're custom. You're always buying parts that are really expensive because you have no volume. And so, yeah, so that was their thesis. They were going to be like the opposite of big traditional aerospace, which is go incredibly fast, cheap, and sort of see if you can just get to an endpoint way quicker than anyone had before.
Yeah. The leadership structure struck me as interesting, but also one that could definitely work. You basically you have the sort of smart, highly talented, experienced engineer who steps aside as sort of a rainmaker, maybe CEO, comes on, and the self-awareness to say, if we want to get this company to really scale and be successful, we need a CEO who can just bring in a lot of money. And that's what Chris Kemp is did. And I mean, I think that self-awareness speaks volumes about Adam. And I'm just curious, you spent time in it, you spent a lot of time with this company. What is that leadership dynamic like at a rocket company?
Well, I think you're right. In this case, Astra with the two co-founders is a bit different than some of the other. I would say in rockets, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it tends to be this possessed, Silicon Valley is full of co-founders, but I'm just thinking on the rockets, a lot of it is led up top by this one person, whereas Astra really did have this dynamic. I think you called it exactly right. Adam London he's a brilliant engineer. He is that MIT PhD, and he'd spent about, I don't know, 15, 16 years doing very interesting work, but these small government contracts on very specific things the government wanted, had a tiny company, but had good technology to play off. And then Chris had worked at NASA, but he was like on the IT side of NASA. He wasn't like building rockets. He comes in as the money guy, and it really worked for a long time. I mean, you had sort of this Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak type thing where you had kind of the front man, the one raising money, trying to inspire people, keep the energy of the company going, and then the technical guy. And it worked well. So, anyway, just to answer your question directly, I think they had a slightly different dynamic than some of the other commercial rocket companies, which seem to be led by one person. And I don't know, it had its pros and cons at Astra, I would say.
Reading the Astra section really drove home to me that the growing interest, I would say, in hard tech in Silicon Valley means that companies are dealing with different types of engineering problems for sure, but also just different types of company building problems. As an example of that, can you talk a little bit about your journey to Alaska with the Astra team?
Yeah, I mean, the again, I love the thesis of Astra, which is let's not make this thing too precious. Let's just build a rocket, fly it, learn from it, build another rocket, fly it, learn from it. There is a tendency, especially with hardware companies, to not release your first product because you're just forever engineering it to be perfect. Whereas software, I think, has a little more tolerance for this like beta culture and having bugs and you fix them as you go. And then a rocket obviously is a much more binary proposition than a software product. If it blows up, you can't fix it on the go. So, they head to Alaska around 2016, 2017. They'd done really well. They'd built a rocket, I think, faster than anybody really had before. So living up to the mission. We go to Kodiak Island. I went with a lot of these guys. And the thinking originally was kind of like you show up at Kodiak, you hook this thing up to some liquid oxygen and kerosene, and off it goes. And then it turned out they had built it so fast that there was just this constant stream of bugs. And so every day we'd go to the launch pad, the rocket would abort, they'd have to take it down, go find some battery that had given out, then you replace the battery, then you go back the next day, and then now, oh, the igniter's not working. And so you got to repeat all this. And this goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so it starts to kind of like undermine both the thesis that you had of the cost benefits of doing this quick and frankly the morale of the troops, because you're far away from your family, you're on this island in Alaska, there's not much to do, and you get almost marooned there for weeks, and it starts to feel a little hopeless. Did that get to the heart of what you were interested in, or?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it was just, yeah, reading that section, I was like, this is really just this is a different set of challenges than what people, maybe normally face if they're building a software company in Palo Alto, and physically demanding, like you said, I mean, you're isolated, you're away from your family, but it's kind of the only way to do it to some degree with a company like Astra.
Yeah, they wanted to like test this out, and then it still could have worked really well. But to your point, I mean, there's just stuff you would never have to deal with at home. It's like it's one thing to think, okay, we're going to go up there and launch pretty quick. We've got enough liquid oxygen to do that. When it starts to drag on, it's like, oh, now we have to ship liquid oxygen from somewhere on the down in the continental U.S. because we've drained Alaska's entire supply. The post office is not, they're getting stuff FedExed in that they want to work on right away, and everything's moving a little slower. In Alaska, you got to kind of bribe the local mail guy with a box of wine to help facilitate your packages and all these things. There was also this interesting tension between commercial space and old space where so they were at this place called the Pacific Spaceport Complex, which had been built for government missions, really testing missiles and things like that. But the center had seen there was this opportunity to be a real player in commercial space, and their heart and their mind was in the right place. They were open to commercial space. They wanted to help these new customers any way they could because otherwise this particular complex wasn't getting used much. But then the guys from Astra would want to work on the rocket for like 18 hours a day until it was like ready to launch. And these guys are running this government facility. They're like, no, you got to do 10-hour shifts. You have to take this many days off, so that startup culture, which people can critique if they want or not, but it's a reality of Silicon Valley, is that when you're in the thick of it, you just kind of keep going. When your company is still kind of quasi in this regulated world, you can't do everything you're used to doing.
Yeah. On a somewhat similar note, I think the scene that stuck with me the most from the book is when you're in the RV outside of Astra HQ with the two engineers, Les Martin and Matthew Flanagan, kind of talking about the space industry, and you guys are watching a football game. I think one of the things that stuck with me a little bit from that scene was I'd be curious if you agree with this, or if this was something you were trying to get across, is just that there's a changing profile maybe of founders and engineers that are populating some of these Silicon Valley companies as capital is flowing more to hard tech companies like Astra. Do you think that's fair? Is that a fair takeaway from that scene?
Okay, that's my favorite part in the book. You're the first person that's ever asked me about it. You're my new favorite person. It's my baby that nobody
Really?
ever asked me about. Yeah, and that's exactly what I was trying to get across. Obviously not my opinion, because most of that section is these two guys talking to each other. But I think space is always presented to us as this, it's our best and brightest, most courageous. It's this thing, you're chasing glory, this kind of mystical pursuit. And I was trying to get across to people that whatever version of space you have in your head has changed quite a bit, and it's regular people working these jobs. And yes, you got like Elon wants to make a colony on Mars, and for sure you've got some people who dream about space and exploring and all that stuff, but you've also got a lot of people, this is a job, and yeah, it's kind of like an exciting job, but it's also full of drudgery, and it's an opportunity just like any other Silicon Valley startup. And if you're, that guy you mentioned, Les Martin, he comes from the military. He was vaguely kind of, he taught himself electronics, then taught himself how to build rocket test stands. This is a guy who was like in Central Texas, and now he finds himself in California. He's not really aligned with the politics and the ethos of California. And so anyway, yeah, you're 100% right. I just wanted people to know what real life was like, and that for some of these people, yeah, it's a fun job, but it's just a job. That's awesome that you picked that out. It's like it's really bugged me that nobody ever goes to that section.
I think part of it, I might be reading too much into this, but one of the, I guess, pieces of imagery that stuck with me was that you're watching a Cowboys Eagles game.
Yeah,
Maybe if it was a Niners game, but I just felt like you including that detail to me felt like you were trying to say something with it. NFC East football is not your typical Silicon Valley way of spending time. I would say people might disagree, but that was my interpretation of it.
no, 100%. When Les told me he was a Cowboys fan and that's what they were going to be doing that weekend, I was like, okay, this is perfect. And then we made a movie about sort of based off the book that just came out on HBO a couple weeks ago called Wild Wild Space. And I actually filmed that entire scene with Les and Matt, and it tragically did not make it into the final cut of the movie, which was also my saddest thing, because if you could, I tried to paint a picture with my words in the book, but if you could see it, you would know this was like everything you're saying is exactly right. I wanted to show that this was a little different from your average software startup and the people doing it.
So Les, he basically says that in his view, the reason they're sitting there in these RVs in Alameda is because of Elon. Elon gave this a shot with SpaceX. He used his own money to make it work, and then once it was successful, that basically inspired VCs who, in Les's view, typically invested in software to try to fund more rocket companies. Do you agree with his assessment?
100%. It should be noted, Les is not saying that from an Elon fanboy place either. He doesn't really care for Elon that much. He used to work at SpaceX. This is his analytical take. And yeah, look, wealthy people had tried in the 90s to do rocket companies. It had not worked. People had tried to build satellite constellations. Bill Gates funded one, Iridium, and it had failed pretty spectacularly. And we'd reached this point where people had tried and they thought, oh, maybe this really is just for governments. Maybe the economics will never make sense. And when SpaceX started, they thought it was crazy. Elon didn't know anything about rockets. He's going to waste all his money. He didn't even have that much money. It was like 100 million to put into this, which sounds like a lot to me, but is not in space land. And even when SpaceX started to do better, everyone still thought they would just bankrupt themselves because that's the inevitable path of this business. You can't compete against NASA and the government. And so once SpaceX reached the International Space Station, I think, and once Falcon 9 started to launch fairly frequently, that really is why the book came to be, because I think it unlocked. There was a lot of people that wanted to do this who had been beaten down by the negativity and the impossibility. So once one person even kind of did it, then it was like, oh, okay, now is the time. Let's try again.
Let's switch gears to Firefly. So Firefly,
Yeah.
it's a rocket company started in 2014 by a pretty credentialed and sort of experienced space industry veteran named Tom Markusek. Goes into bankruptcy 3 years later, and then all of a sudden, a very wealthy man from Ukraine named Max Polyakov buys it out of bankruptcy, reinstalls Tom as the CEO, and then they're sort of this dynamic duo trying to build the company. Similar question, I guess, is to the one I had with Astra. From spending time in it, what do you think about that sort of leadership dynamic where you have the very experienced sort of engineer, space industry veteran as the CEO, but the money person is also very closely sort of involved?
Well, that dynamic, as people will see in the book, was quite intense. And I would not say, always a smooth running operation. I mean, that relationship was about as complicated as it can get. Max was wealthy. His family all worked on the Soviet space program, and so he had that in his blood, but he had never been a aerospace engineer, and so really was not in a position to not to be making very fine grained technical decisions on any of the rocket. And so Tom had worked at NASA, he'd worked at SpaceX. He was the adult supervision when it came to the actual engineering. The two of them end up having a very tense relationship where, of course, the rocket's taking longer than it should to build, because that's what always happens with rockets. Max is wealthy, but he's not Jeff Bezos wealthy, so he's seeing his checks gets spent every month and is actually starting to sweat the whole process. And so he's taking it out on Tom. Max is Ukrainian. This is way before the war. And people had little bit of like, who is this Ukrainian guy with the rocket company? Whereas Tom is a good old American boy and he was a great public face. And so, I would say their dynamic was quite fraught. It actually resulted in a really fantastic rocket getting to the pad in a very acceptable amount of time. So somehow it worked. But I don't think I would wish that dynamic on too many people.
Yeah, no, and it goes to show sometimes the dynamic amongst leadership doesn't have to be perfectly warm all the time to get great results. Sometimes that's just the way the world works. And Max, I'd say to his credit, at least from what I saw in the book, seemed very genuine, very earnest about trying to make this happen and was motivated for the right reasons, it seemed to me. At least my takeaway was that he fell into some of the same traps that maybe the really wealthy people from the 90s fell into when they tried to fund rocket companies.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I mean, everybody wants to get rich, but that's not really why he was doing it. He was just so enamored and fascinated with aerospace and the idea that he could be this immigrant with an American rocket company. And he wanted also to get a lot of the old Ukrainian engineering to have it stay alive, have all those amazing things the Ukrainians had done for the Soviet space program, find new life. And so, I think those were the driving forces to keep him at it. And I think you see it happen over and over again in the rocket business. It's like everybody starts out with this clean sheet of paper. It's like, we're going to do it faster and cheaper than anyone's done before. We'll be in the pad in like 2 years. And everyone starts that way. And the rocket starts smaller than it should be because you're going to save some money and do these things. And then I just saw it repeat again and again. It always takes about 3 times as long. The crazy thing about rockets is you build what feels like 95% of the thing and you build the first 95% in about 18 months. And then the last 5% takes, for some reason, 3-4 years to get all those kinks worked out. And it's that part that starts to put all the pressure on everyone as the money starts dwindling.
Mm-hmm. The story of Firefly involves some national security issues, and we saw some of this too with Rocket Lab. Given the expertise and the financial support that can come from overseas for rocket companies, what sort of balancing act does the US government have to do when overseeing the commercial space industry?
Well, everyone's got to remember these are fundamentally ICBMs, and the US's general policy is that it wants as few countries on Earth to have the ability to send up an ICBM as possible. And so you don't even see, I mean, obviously, places like North Korea and Iran are trying to do these things. You don't see like a ton of countries in South America. Africa has tried space occasionally a couple times. Europe is only now kind of getting some commercial space rocket companies. And so I don't know, the US's general policy is not to really help or encourage people to do this. They're sort of happy with the status quo. New Zealand is a special case because it's part of Five Eyes. And so when Peter Beck, I mean, it's pretty amazing, right? I mean, so he built his rocket and then really had to like ask the Americans for permission to exist, more or less, if he wanted to take American capital, if he wanted to get missions tied to American payloads. And it took a really long time, even though they were in New Zealand. It's a Five Eyes country. The United States really wasn't sure it wanted another. Rocket Lab has 2 launch sites now, but its main one that it started with was in New Zealand. They weren't sure they really wanted that to open up. So Peter spent 6 months in Washington. He had to go all the way up to Obama to like get this cleared. So, I mean, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yeah, there's all kinds of restrictions. The US is pretty torn. It would prefer to obviously kind of control all this in some measure if it can.
Right, right. With all the hype going on right now around AI, a lot of people have been making analogies to the dot-com era, where a lot of the early winners, a lot of those companies that were big names early on, ultimately didn't make it long term. And what's happened in commercial space over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years feels a little bit different to me because the amount of capital that it takes and the amount of red tape that you have to go through becomes a huge moat once these companies are on the other side of it. Do you see a ton of upcoming competition for sort of first batch of rocket and satellite companies and for there to be this sort of leapfrogging effect that happens in this industry? Or do you think a lot of the winners here are sort of already determined?
Well, let's separate the rockets and the satellites for a second. Okay, SpaceX is dominant. They're going to be around for a long time. Rocket Lab has won the small rocket part. It's hard for me to imagine somebody else. I don't even know what the point of them making a small rocket at this stage really would be. And so there's kind of like this middle ground of these mid-sized rockets. That's where most of the startups right now are. So the idea is you can carry quite a few satellites. You're still that much cheaper. Some of them focus on reusability. We don't really have a reusable mid-sized rocket right now. And the big question starts to become how many rocket companies does the world need? And that's interesting. And you have to divide this up by region because Russia's not going to be flying on an American rocket and China's not going to be, and Europe is not really going to be either. So it's kind of like how many rockets does the US and its allies need? And then how many rockets do all these other people need? And so how many companies can fill this demand? So SpaceX will be around, Rocket Lab will be around. I think there's probably room for one more. Blue Origin is backed by Jeff Bezos. They've been at it for 20 years. They still haven't flown a rocket that could carry a satellite or a human, but they are on the verge of doing that allegedly this year. Certainly, they have the deep pockets to do really whatever they want. So, yeah, I kind of think we end up with like four. And unless, there is this like dramatic rise in the number of satellites that need to go up, but SpaceX is doing a lot and like probably could do even more. And it's got Starship coming, which is its bigger rocket. So in my head, I feel like there's room really for like one other of these pure kind of startups to make it and make a name for themselves. And then, yeah, it gets hard after that. You know what's happening is there's an evolution taking place as well, which is it used to be you were a rocket company and then there were satellite companies. And now all this stuff is merging together because the rocket business is terrible, even if you're SpaceX. And all the money's in communications, data, imagery, any kind of service you can deliver from low Earth orbit. So all these rocket companies are taking on more and more of the satellite part. They will build 90% of the satellite for you. You just put your special little sensor or payload on there. And so I think that's the evolution, and those guys will be pretty well entrenched.
Yeah.
It's a funny business. It's not like Google or, Yahoo's there and then Google comes along with a better algorithm. The brutal thing about launching rockets is that it's physics and we've tried everything we know of. It's hard to see some like huge breakthrough where you just do something that nobody else could do because there's just limitations. There is one company called Spin Launch, which has a space catapult, which is a crazy idea, but that's what it would take is to like not even be using a rocket on the first stage. They just throw things to the edge of space with a catapult.
I would agree. I mean, just my assessment, and I haven't spent a ton of time looking at it, but it seems like the rocket companies have a pretty good amount of durability. I guess like they're just behind a pretty wide moat at this point. But they also, to your point, they're going to want to start to launch their own satellites, drive more revenue that way. And then the pure satellite companies is probably just going to keep getting more and more competitive. It seems to me.
Yeah, for that other part of your question, yeah, the satellites really, it's a computing business. And so do you just have a really interesting thing your computer can do? And I think there will be a lot of shakeout among satellite companies over time as people start trying out new things. And we're kind of moving. I don't know how excited to get about it yet. But this year we saw Varda Space. They make a capsule where you can do pharmaceutical experiments in the capsule. You could call it like a first stab at manufacturing in space. Now that as these rocket prices come down and become more frequent, we might start moving beyond satellites to test out some new ideas. So that's really where all the fun and the excitement is and the money, I think, is rockets are just your FedEx, your transport to get the interesting stuff there.
Right. To conclude, because we're at time, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I think this is public. If it's not, let me know. For the last while, you've been writing a book about Sam Altman and OpenAI. Is that right?
Yep, that's kind of one of my many next projects. Yeah, I got the filmmaking bug, so I've been working on some new documentaries across like a pretty wide variety of fields, and that's the book that I've been researching and still am researching. I was just at a OpenAI thing right before this.
Well, I'm sure people will be very excited to read that when it comes out, myself included. Ashlee Vance, thank you so much for doing this. Really enjoyed your book. I learned a ton. It was an area I didn't really know very much about at first, very complicated one, but you explained it all very simply. And it was a really, really fun read as well.
Thanks, man. I hope, yeah, I think some people see space in there and get fixated on that. I tried to like tell it to where anybody could enjoy reading the book, whether you're in space or not. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.